Hi there, I'm David Harvey. I'm here with John Andrews, and this is the Two Texts podcast. In this podcast, we're two friends in two different countries, here every 2 weeks, talking about two different texts from the Bible. This, however, is our launch series, and so we're bringing you a daily episode of the two of us talking about the parables of Jesus. This is episode 6, and it's called Samaritan.
So, David, today we're looking at probably, I might suggest, one of the most famous parables of Jesus. I think in one form or another, it finds its way into our conversations and language. And it's the story, sometimes the translators in our Bibles entitle it The Parable of the Good Samaritan. Again, another lovely, unique parable in the Gospel of Luke. Interestingly, this is the only Gospel it appears in. And you think it's such a rocking parable. It would have been great to see it in other Gospels, but clearly Dr. Luke is trying to say something to us through this. And so we're going to delve into that today and have a little bit of a look at this gorgeous and challenging and controversial little parable. So why don't you read it to us from Luke chapter 10?
All right, and verse 25. So it goes like this. Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. You kind of feel like that's maybe not going to go well. I know I'm supposed to just be reading the text, but you just kind of feel like this is the beginning of a disaster story right here.
Yeah.
So just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And he said to him, what is written in the law? What do you read there? He answered, well, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, you have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live. But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? And he said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, go and do likewise.
Stunningly good. Stunningly good. It's an incredible story. And I think, again, hopefully if people have been following us in our little podcasts, I hope this doesn't sound too repetitive, but of course, having grown up in church, the only time I really heard this parable used was in what we called our gospel service. Mm-hmm. And what we meant by that was it was generally a Sunday night service, and it was when we sort of designed the service to invite non-believers to sort of think about being believers. And every single time in my upbringing I heard this parable preached, it was in that context. Now, ironically, I grew up in Northern Ireland, and at the time of my upbringing, we were absolutely entrenched in what has become known as the Troubles. Catholic communities at war with Protestant communities, a sort of a nationalist paramilitary force against a loyalist paramilitary force, with the British Army sort of stuck somewhere in the middle, and ordinary people like us stuck somewhere in the middle. And I had the joy of growing up on what was called, probably as an oxymoron, it was called the peace line. And it was a flashpoint essentially between two communities. I grew up in a Protestant community, and literally across the road was a Catholic community. And eventually they had to build a big wall between those two communities, which was incredible. So the ultimate irony for me is I began to then later on, as a young person, an older teenager and then a young adult, started to seriously study the scriptures. And I started to get into this text. I realized that actually, of all the parables that really could have spoke to the situation I grew up in, this was the one. And yet every time I heard it preached on, the actual meaning of this parable never ever got to the ears of its listeners. And it was turned into a beautiful little metaphor of how someone who's lost gets found by Jesus, who's the type of the Good Samaritan, and Jesus pours it in the oil and the wine and saves us. That's how it was taught us. And yet that's not actually what the parable is about. And for years I was genuinely misled. No, I don't mean deliberately, but I mean, I think people didn't want to read the real meaning of this parable. I think people wanted to soften this parable up in order to not have to be confronted with there's Samaritans out there. There are people not like us out there. There are people that I don't want to have anything to do with out there. And I don't want to have my faith challenge me to have anything to do with those people out there. And I think this parable absolutely leans into the sort of social, religious, ethnic polarization that Jesus's world would have experienced from a day-to-day perspective. Is that fair in terms of an observation?
Well, experienced, I would say, and even promoted. There's a lot of evidence that not only was there significant boundaries in the time of Jesus, but these were valued. That these boundaries were treasured. Even there's some evidence that it wouldn't be uncommon, for a Jewish man to pray a prayer that opened with "Thank God I'm not a Gentile." The boundaries were. To use your example of the peace line, there was somebody out there every day repainting it, making sure we don't want to make sure this line doesn't fade, and I think we're probably still in the same boat to this day, aren't we? In that sense that we like these divisions. I mean, a couple of things that I think are interesting, if you want to know a little bit more about the divisions between Jews and Samaritans, without even getting a Bible dictionary out or your kind of introduction to the Bible type handbook, just jump over to John chapter 4 and you get a dialogue between Jesus and a Samaritan woman, which is very much around that. Well, we don't really get on very well, us lot, do we? So, and it's funny, isn't it, how often the people that we get along with least are most similar to us, and I remember, John, once when I was doing my doctorate, I took a phenomenal class on by one of the university's Jewish scholars, who a scholar of modern Judaism, a brilliant man, Professor Langton, and I remember him talking to us, and there was 3 of us in the class. We all came from Christian backgrounds, right? And now think about this statement that he's about to make in the line of what you've just said about Northern Ireland and Protestant and Catholicism. And we were talking, and he said, here's the thing you need to understand. He said, for the average Jewish person, he says, when we look at Christians, we can't tell the difference between Protestants and Catholics. He says, we just can't figure it out. And then somebody like, yourself, you're thinking, what a statement to make. What you mean you can't tell the difference? The differences are obvious, but they're obvious because we're so close to each other,
True.
And an outsider looks in and goes, what are those folks arguing about? Because they seem to all believe the same stuff, Well, Jews and Samaritans are, when you actually listen to the woman talk to Jesus, they're having an argument about a mountain. It's like, well, we think it's this mountain, and you think it's that mountain. Again, you see this like in first century history. It generally seems to be that it's probably around about 120 or after that the Romans start being able to tell the difference between Jews and Christians. So all of that to say, it's amazing how angry we can get at people who are remarkably similar to us, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's important for reading this parable at some sort of level. So the parable picks up in John chapter 10. And again, I'm going to be repetitive for a moment, but I think it's important. It's such an important exegetical point. The parables don't happen in isolation. They happen as parts
True.
of stories. So
Yep.
if you've been reading through Luke from start to finish, in chapter 9, you realize, if you just pay attention, Jesus is beginning to journey through Samaria. And towards Samaria. He's somewhere on that sort of journey. So he's gathered this mob. I want to call them disciples, but I think there's evidence that it's not quite that harmonious. There's this group of people who are with him, and the text has said Jesus is now heading to Jerusalem. He said, right, we're going. So in the narrative of Luke, this is a significant shift, isn't it? This is the journey to the cross has begun. And so Jesus is on this journey, and he's even sent some disciples ahead to figure out some, accommodational type issues in Samaria, right? So they're carving through Samaritan territory, this band of Jewish people. And then Jesus tells a story about a Samaritan. So the scene to me is set quite excitedly in that sort of sense. And Jesus has done one other little thing that I think is worth the serious reader just paying attention to. In the lead up to this story, you've had a couple of kind of interesting little things happen where Jesus has started to. He sent out a mission, basically. He's got 70 of them. He said, right, you're going to go off and do some stuff. And there's all these famous bits of text. So they're actually, Luke isn't absolutely nailed on with the geography here, but there's nothing he says to contradict the idea that they're heading towards and through Samaritan territory. So there's even a level that chapter 10, this mission of the 70, is almost potentially even a Samaritan mission at some sort of level. I'm just seeing that there, and he's given them instructions. This is how you behave. This is how you deal. And then in the middle of that, he's just kind of throwing out this series of woes to some Galilean towns, which is really quite interesting, because he said to them, some of these places you're going to go with this message, people are not going to accept you. They're going to reject you. And you can almost feel the nuance of the crowd going, yeah, that'll be them Samaritans, right? Of course they're going to reject this. And then Jesus says, hey, what about it? Wait a minute. And then he lists 3 Galilean towns and says, listen, you guys are in trouble because in fact it's going to be worse for you than Tyre and Sidon, the kind of archetypal troublesome towns from Old Testament, right? And he basically unrolls out that even them have not listened properly. So there's a little bit of tension rising in the parable, and I can imagine some murmuring around these people. So Jesus is sending a mission out to these folks. He's now criticizing the good old hometown places that, I can't believe that's what Jesus is intending to do, they might be thinking. And then he gets this test from a lawyer. Almost like, again, we're forced to do a bit of imaginative work by Luke in this, but I'm seeing this sense of almost this. And when we say lawyer, nomikos in the Greek, I would say, John, don't think, the guy that you go to work out your, where your fence is because the neighbor seems to be letting his dog into your yard. We're talking expert in Torah. It would be my read. This is a religious legal expert, which of course in the ancient world, that blend for Israel between Torah and regular laws is probably a lot blurrier for us anyway. So I almost think that you've got this religious expert jumping up, like he stood up, and almost in the sense of, all right, this is too far. This is too far, because I don't get what's going on here anymore. So you get the question that's almost an early question. This is the kind of question you expect, not in the middle of the mission, right? You expect this question early on in your journey of following Jesus, that, hey, how do I get eternal life? And then Jesus will explain that, and you'll decide, oh, I'm going to follow. So my reading of this, John, but I'm always open to different nuances. My reading of this is almost an exasperated. So I'm going to go back to the beginning here, says this lawyer. I just need to start again. How do I inherit eternal life? Because the events of the last kind of little bit have just kind of thrown me in a bit of a tiz. I don't know where we're going anymore. I mean, do you think that is that how you would potentially see that passage?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think how Jesus responds to his question is interesting. So I think it leans into a sense in which the expert is grappling for meaning, he's grappling for understanding. So again, our sort of modern evangelical world would interpret that question in a very sort of, how do I get my sins forgiven and go to heaven type question? Whereas he's asking something more about the kingdom of God, what Jesus is about. How do we enter into this that you're talking about?
Yes. How do we live,
looking,
essentially?
Exactly. He's looking for some traction on the ideas. And of course, if, as Luke's gospel is showing us, we've got this drive to the margins, this Jesus pulling the margins through and pulling them together, and that gathers more and more momentum, then it is creating real consternation in people who are trying to work this out from the Torah. And from the text. And so Jesus' answer, I think, is really telling. Jesus answers the question with a question.
Very, very rabbinic.
It is, absolutely. And I think there are over 300 questions that Jesus asks in the Gospels. Just incredible amount of questions.
There's a brilliant moment in a modern interview with Elie Wiesel, the famous writer from the Holocaust, and the interviewer said to him, a European interviewer said to him, "I noticed that you Jews always seem to answer questions with questions." He says, "Why do you do that?" And to which Wiesel said, "Why not?"
Too good.
It's just too good.
That's too good. But of course, when we are introduced to dialogue between God, the God of the garden in the beginning, and the first humans, God, the first recorded dialogue between them is a question. Where are you? So you're getting a context in which questions are very normal in a first century world of scholarship, which now we've got, if you like, a rabbi and an expert in the law having a debate. The idea of asking each other questions and a sort of a more confrontational or caustic form of learning is much more comfortable for them. We get a bit in the West, especially in the UK. We would be a bit, that was a bit full on, that was a bit harsh. Whereas in a Jewish worldview, I think they're much more comfortable with like hard questions, testing the text, yes, iron sharpening iron, getting into it and arguing the text. The meaning is found in the argument. So Jesus then simply responds, throws the ball back into his court and said, well, what is written in the law? How do you read it? Or how do you interpret it? What do you think Moses says within this? And so throwing the responsibility back on the expert of the law to see where he's coming from. And of course, he responds in a classic way. He quotes part of the Shema and he quotes Leviticus 19. He puts those two ideas together. The only two times in the Torah where ve'ahavta, the idea of and you shall love, is repeated. So, and you shall love the Lord your God, ve'ahavta, is the idea used there. And then, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So we've got two phrases used that bring these two ideas together. And in the Torah, you've got the big ideas of love God, love your neighbor, and love the stranger. So they're powerful ideas rooted in the text. So what Jesus is about to launch into shouldn't really surprise the expert in the law. And when then he answers, well, yeah, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. I think he adds mind in the context of that. And love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus goes, boom, answered. Outstanding.
What's interesting,
great job.
Isn't it? In the Greek, Jesus says the word that he uses is orthos. You have answered orthos, which is where actually that ortho rightly,
Orthodoxy.
correctly, but it's where we get the word orthodoxy. So I almost want to, Jesus almost says, you've given an orthodox answer.
Absolutely. You've
your
given the
answer
right
is
answer.
bang on. Also, it's interesting to note that the answer the guy gives is quite a common one. We've seen Jesus give this answer himself elsewhere, but even like in fact, there's a brilliant little Jewish story about Rabbi Shammai and Rabbi Hillel, and they were the two kind of big rabbis of the kind of Jesus time. And you were either in Hillel's camp or Shammai's camp if you were. And I think a lot of the discussions you see around Jesus actually are Pharisees and teachers and these sort of people asking Jesus which camp he's in. Are you in? Hillel was a bit of a liberal. Shammai was a hardline conservative. Interestingly, Jesus, with the exception of one occasion, in all of the discussions that he's asked, which we can track to discussions about Hillel or Shammai, Jesus always sides with Hillel on the slightly more graceful approach to reading the law, with the exception of marriage, where Jesus actually rejects Hillel and leans more to the importance of marriage. So maybe a podcast for the future for us.
Yes, absolutely.
But the story is told that a young man went to test Shammai one day and said to him, can you recite the whole law while I stand on one foot? To which Shammai said, go away. So then he went to Hillel and said, can you recite the whole law when I stand on one foot? To which Hillel said, do not do what is hateful to you to your neighbor. He said, this is the whole law, and the rest is commentary. And so it's interesting that when the young man gives this response, it's a positive version, love your neighbor as yourself, which we see Jesus also say somewhere. But it's realizing this is clearly a discussion that's going on around the time of Jesus. Is how do you boil the law down into sort of something, tweet-worthy almost we've got a lot of laws, we need it in a sentence. And so actually you get this sense that this was a common way of Jesus. It's a pretty stereotypical answer that Jesus has allowed here in that sense. It's orthodox, it's not revolutionary, it's not brand new. It's if we just go Old Testament to New Testament, we might think, wow, like goodness, Jesus has really torn it up here with this thing. Well, actually, this is orthodoxy that Jesus has just rolled out here at this sort of point.
It is. No, absolutely right. And I think then his response is sort of affirmative, but okay, yeah, that's great. Do this and you'll live. You've answered your question. Well done. Let's move on.
A star.
Now, exactly. Now, whether Jesus senses that the expert has an agenda here or not, he doesn't encourage the agenda. He's simply going, "You've got the right answer." And I think you just need to do that. Yeah. And that's the moment when the expert just should have went, okay,
I've done well.
Move on.
I came out alive.
Absolutely. Let's move on because I've answered this correctly. But the telling sort of killer punch in this story up to this point is this whole idea, but wanting to justify himself. Yeah. So there's clearly a bit of point scoring going on here. So I've got the right answer, which he knew he had. I mean, this, as you say, this is a pretty standard summary of Torah.
Yeah.
Love God with all your heart is not only the Shema, it's the summary of the first 4 great words of God, the 4 great commandments. And love your neighbor as yourself is the summary of the second 6 great commandments. I mean, it's, this is sort of scholarship 101.
Yeah, any rabbi is going to tell you this.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And any boy that's gone to Torah school would have would have got that. So clearly Jesus maybe senses, without reading too much into it, okay, there's probably an agenda here. There's something going on. But he makes the agenda difficult. He doesn't feed the agenda. He says, yep, great answer. Do this and live. Yeah. Boom, done.
So do you think there's... and this might be where you're going, so forgive me if I'm jumping in on you, John, there, but like there's the agenda, but there's also this, I find there's like a Lucan second level. If you just, and I would almost always want to encourage anyone reading the Bible text just to think and pause and read slowly. This is what kind of all of our podcasts will ultimately be about, is reading more slowly. You've got some really key Lucan theological answers in here. And I think that right at the very start, the guy gets himself into trouble with his opening question. What must I do to inherit eternal life. Now, the question itself is slightly faulty if you think about it. That'd be like, imagine, turning up to your, an only child goes to their parents. What do I need to do to inherit, from you? Well, you do nothing. In that sense, if it's an inheritance, it's not about what you do. So there's a slightly kind of problematic notion there. And even just the question of, well, what do I need to do? We see in another story of Jesus, a rich man comes to Jesus and says, what do I need to do? And Jesus tells him what he needs to do, and it's too difficult. It's too much. But I think the critique of Jesus is always in Luke's gospel, well, you're not going to be able to do anything. If you want to insist on what you do, you're always going to find that you'll fall short. And that's where the whole grace narrative comes in. But that then seems to me to be fully exposed. Like, what do I need to do? When Jesus goes, oh, you want to do something? Here you go, do this. Now, I can't help, as a Pauline scholar, because that was my area of research and expertise, I can't help but draw into Romans chapter 7, where Paul makes the point, the problem isn't the law, the problem is our inability to do it, right? So Jesus says, well, just love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Yeah, that's enough. But of course, the Lucan critique is, by the time we get to the cross, realize nobody can do this, right? This is beyond us. All that God has asked of us is to love our neighbor, and we can't, And so then you get the second Lucan echo, I think, of the kind of Pauline theology, which I'm convinced is intentional, wanting to justify himself. I'm seeking. Yeah. So in English, we talk about justification and we talk about righteousness. But of course, in Greek, that's the same word. So wanting to show himself as righteous. So there's a self-righteousness. What do I need to do? How do I prove it? And now I'm going to try and exemplify it. So, I mean, I just jumping in, and interrupting you with that, John, but it just feels like that nuance is at play in Luke here.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that in dealing with the sort of religious community, he's always pushing those ideas around. And in a world, that the expert of the law would have represented. So, we reflected in a previous podcast, Paul, who it regards to the law blameless. So there's an attention to detail here, which is quite profound. So yeah, absolutely. What do I need to do? And Jesus says, do this, do what you've just said, and live. But clearly another agenda is at work. And so the man asks, okay, trying to justify himself. Okay, well, who is my neighbor? Now, isn't that a strange question? And I think it leans into the opening conversation and trajectory that you created, that if you've got a movement towards the south, which definitely from Luke chapter 9, we've got a north to south trajectory geographically. And there is the idea that Jesus is picking up the sort of waifs and strays of society, the marginalized, are gluing themselves to him, or
and now he's heading towards Samaria.
Yeah, absolutely. Or at the very least, they're hanging around him. Isn't that a strange question? So when he says, "Well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, and love your neighbor as yourself," and so Jesus says, "Do this and live." Of all the questions he could have asked, he asked that question.
Yeah.
So there's clearly a motivation here around the type of people that Jesus is gathering. It has to be an allusion to that, because it doesn't seem to be the most obvious question you would ask in that regard. Because I would have started with, well, okay, Jesus, well, what does loving God with all my heart look like in your opinion? That might have been the starting question that I had, but he asks, who's my neighbor? Which means that's on his mind.
Yes, we're heading towards this part of the country, and you're not going to ask me to love them too, are you, Jesus?
Exactly. And if this guy is hanging around Jesus, this expert, or he's been assigned by the religious community to sort of take notes and observe and feedback, then he's clearly, perhaps, I would suggest, he is clearly nervous about the sorts of crowd that's hanging around Jesus. And therefore, this is the killer question. It's, okay, who's my neighbor? So reading between the lines, are you saying this bunch are my neighbor? Are you saying the Samaritans are my neighbor? Are you saying some of the people that you've ministered to already on the very fringes of our society and even outside of our society is my neighbor? So it's a loaded question. And of course, it's designed to force Jesus to define neighbor. It's a brilliant question. So it's going to corner Jesus in such a way. Well, yeah, Jew is your neighbor, Samaritan is not.
Yes.
Okay, a white person's your neighbor, black person's not. Okay, a straight person's your neighbor, a gay person's not. So actually, what he's trying to do is get Jesus to name some folks. So tell me who my neighbor is, and of course, it opens a moment of absolute genius where Jesus doesn't name a name, but Jesus tells a story. And in the story, it becomes apparent who the man's neighbor is. And I think this is profoundly powerful for us within this. It's the telling of the story that shows the expression of the Torah. That actually the man who did is the man who was. And the man who was, therefore, by implication, according to your definition of inheriting eternal life, is the man who's also loving God. So suddenly the lawyer, by his answer, love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbors yourself, has set up a scenario where whoever this neighbor is that Jesus is about to land is by definition loving his neighbor and therefore loving God and therefore, according to the Jewish expert, inheriting eternal life. So it's a really, really troublesome moment. And so he's following the story with interest as Jesus launches into it.
The lack of identity is actually quite interesting in this then as well, isn't it? Because,
Profound.
So who is my neighbor? I mean, it's so good, John. It's like metaphorically, it's like the man jumps into a lion's cage because he dropped his sandwich, right? and he grabs his sandwich and gets out alive and then decides, I'm going to do that again. So it's like he stands up to test Jesus. He asks the question. Jesus says to him, yeah, that's right. Do it. Rather than going, man, I'm going to write a book about this. He goes, gosh, no, I'm coming back. I'm doing that again. And I 100% resonate with what you're saying there. But Jesus' reply is interesting.
It is.
Anthropos in the Greek, where we get the word anthropology from. So even man is a slightly assumptive translation here, right? So it would not be bad translation a man is not a bad translation, but you could literally a human was going like, do you think it's significant that Jesus gives about as least descriptive a way? What do we know about the man that was helped by the Good Samaritan? Well, we don't actually even know it was a man. We have a human. It's like a person. So a person was going. That might even be the better translation, actually, mightn't it? A person was going from who is this person? You don't know, right? I mean, do you think there's something in that?
Oh, I do. And of course, what sometimes, unfortunately, certain texts and certain translations have done, it's inserted a Jewish man. I mean, I've literally seen that in some translations.
I mean, later on in the parable, you do see that it probably is a man because you get masculine pronouns, admittedly.
Yes.
But the opening line, you're just getting, it's a person.
A person. A person went down. And of course, you're giving no clue to his identity or her identity. You're just told. So it's not a Jewish person. So for example, if we were trying to work out, is this person white or black? We don't know. Is this person Jewish or Gentile? We actually don't know. Is this person rich or poor? Well, wealthy enough to be robbed of something, but okay.
Yeah.
Is this person gay or straight? No idea. I mean, we actually don't know a single thing about him other than this person was going from Jerusalem to Jericho and got the life beat out of him in order to get his stuff. That's all we know. So as we look at this person lying on the side of the road, we have no clue who He is.
Mm.
And I think that's deliberate. I think
Yes.
that's the point of this parable, because the point is not the identity of the person, but
Mm.
the action of the Samaritan. That's
Uh-huh.
what defines this moment. Um, Now, of course, you can read the sort of Jewish Samaritan idea into this, and of course, I think it's all there, and I have no problem with that. But the fact that Jesus doesn't heavily labor that idea. So, and I think, right. So, to be fair to the priest and the Levite, okay, I think that leans into their hesitancy because they don't know who this is. All right, this could be a Gentile. This could be a Jew. This I don't know who this is. Okay, so actually, their hesitancy is because they can't um, clarify the identity of the person potentially,
Mm.
and therefore they move on
Because that would
rather
have
than get.
implications for their ministry in that
Absolutely
sense.
would.
Yeah.
And in order to identify, you would have to get closer,
Mm.
and they don't want to do that. Maybe for other reasons, so they pass by quickly. Um, but I noticed something beautiful here, David, that we might lean into a bit later on when we look at the parable of the two sons. But it says of the Samaritan, which is absolutely beautiful. Verse 33: But a Samaritan, as he travelled, came to where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. It's same language used of the father who's looking for the son in Luke 15, which we'll probably get to later on in our little series, and had compassion on him. Same phrase used. So you get this beautiful idea that he's not just drawing near, but he is involved. He saw him. And whatever he saw, it didn't put him off. And then he had compassion on him. Something deep inside him gets moved here. And we still aren't clear on the identity of the man who's been beaten up. The only identity now we've got is a Samaritan came near in terms of this relationship. So now the emphasis is on the Samaritan, not really on the man.
Yes. Yes.
And actually, it's the actions of that Samaritan that Jesus is drawing the attention to.
The threefold format's really interesting as well, isn't it? The priest saw him, the Levite saw him, and the Samaritan saw him. So all three of them encounter the same thing. It strikes me, John, that there's this is more of an aside comment for a moment, but I want to make it. Luke is a Greek writer. He's not Jewish. We know this from various things that we can sort of discern from Luke and Acts. He's clearly well educated in Jewish systems, however. And so I just make a couple of side comments to get to the comment I want to make. But, even like little things that I think are fascinating in Luke's gospel, just for the person that wants to dig around deeper. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. That suggests he has some knowledge of the geography of the area, because if you go from Jerusalem to Jericho, it's downhill, right? In that sense. He was set upon by, most translations have robbers. There's a long history as to why that word is translated to robbers, and you have to go back into the King James to do that. The word is leistes, right? In Matthew's gospel, it's the same word used to define the two people that are crucified beside Jesus, right? The word in Josephus, Josephus consistently describes the zealot insurrectionists as leistes, right? So there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that leistes are terrorists. Really, they're insurrectionists from the perspective of the ruling classes. So Josephus is writing as a Jewish person trying to win the Romans over at some level. So he writes what's the Roman perspective. So they're leistes. Now it's interesting. From best I can deduce, King James, who was obviously the king, was slightly uncomfortable with the use of insurrectionist because that exposes the fact that only insurrectionists are crucified. There's two types of people are crucified, right? Insurrectionists and slaves. So we don't really want to draw attention to the fact in a kind of political history of UK at that particular time that Jesus was clearly not a slave, so was executed as an insurrectionist. So you end up with this language of the more softer translation of robber being the common one. However, it is known that the zealot insurrectionists often did hang around in that road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and basically that's how they funded their campaigns, was just rob off with people who were passing through that road. It's known to be a dangerous road.
Well, and I would just jump in and say I've actually seen that road. So I've had the privilege of being in Israel 3 times.
But you didn't get robbed.
No, didn't get robbed because I was on a lovely air-conditioned bus the first 2 times on the way up to Jerusalem from Jericho. But one of the routes that we went allowed us to see what was accepted as probably the route that Jesus was referring to, and it's extremely isolated,
Yes.
extremely vulnerable. If you were caught there on your own, you are in big trouble.
Yes.
And it's prime. There's no way you'd want to be traveling on that road on your own.
Yes, I'm imagining something from one of those scenes in the early Star Wars movies where somebody can jump out from behind a rock, rob you, and be back behind the rock before you've even realized.
Yeah, and there's just it's whole stretches of that road completely exposed, so no housing, there's no villages, there's no towns. It's very, very exposed. You wouldn't want to travel on your own. You would want to travel in a caravan. So the fact that the man is traveling on his own, remember, it's a made-up story, but the chances are Jesus is probably, they've read this in the news. I mean, this stuff happens a lot, and so it would be a made-up story, but rooted in truth, I think.
Absolutely. So this is interesting. And so Luke's reflecting this story to us with a lot of detail that suggests some real kind of first-hand eyewitness. Whoever Luke's source is telling the story as it was told, which is fascinating. But then the second part of just real contextual piece. So you get this is an accurate depiction. This sort of thing happens there, So I remember some years ago being in Chicago with a friend, and we got lost and ended up traveling through a particular part of Chicago. And then we got back to the people that we were staying with. And the next morning over breakfast, they said, "Did you have a nice evening in the city?" And we said, "Oh, yeah, we did." I said, "We got a little lost on the way home, and we ended up coming through this particular area." And their faces went like drained of color as they said that. They said, "You went where?" And we said, "Well, we went to that area." And they were, "Oh my goodness, And so the area had a reputation. The road to Jerusalem to Jericho has a reputation. But then the second little contextual color piece is this choice of priest, Levite. And so now in the temple, you see there are kind of 3 groups of people who are commonly referred to as serving there. There's priests, there's Levites, and there's lay people. And there's some evidence. I think, again, this is me reading Kenneth Bailey, if I recall correctly, of my source here. But you get quite a lot of Jewish stories of this time period hold this 3-person format. Like, you and I have both lived growing up with the other end of kind of Englishman, Irishman, Scotsman jokes, right? And stuff like that. And they always seem to be told by the English people about the Scots people and the Irish people, right? But if somebody starts a story with, an Englishman and Irishman, you know what the next one is. It's a Scotsman. So if I say an English and Irishman and a Russian went into a bar, you'd be like, "Oh, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right." So there's an interesting sense that when Jesus says a priest, a Levite, his listeners all know who the third person is going to be. Absolutely. And so you're almost thinking, I think if you're listening to this story for the first time, you go, "Oh, I get what he's doing here. The super religious person didn't help, but the regular good Jewish person is going to come and help the situation here. He's going to be the hero," because that's how that story format works. So it's really interesting that for me that we catch the controversy, the twist, the sense that Jesus just an Englishman, an Irishman, and a Russian, a priest, a Levite, and and I think to grasp
Yes,
it, John, you've almost got to think about who is, like, I think if you're telling this story in the modern times, who's our Samaritan? You know what I mean? Because this, like, to the listener, this is a huge shock, right? This is a Christopher Nolan Inception, Tenet type twist. That, whoa, my goodness, how is this character even in this story? And the moment Jesus has introduced this person, you're now thinking, well, I don't know how this story is going to go anymore because I thought I knew the format of the story we were telling. and now I'm just like, it's the roller coaster has gone over the top, and our seatbelts have all fallen off, and we're plummeting out of control into this. Is that how you kind of feel this
Oh,
sense of?
absolutely. I think when Jesus just goes, a Samaritan, however, I think at that moment you have a collective intake of breath. I think you've got shock, and the expert in the law, who is an extremely clever man. Remember, this expert knows the Torah. He will have been trained in argumentation. He knows how to corner someone. He knows the chess pieces to move in order to checkmate you in any argument. As soon as Samaritan comes out of his mouth, the expert knows where this is going. He knows he is stuffed, right? And I think you get the sense of it, David, because when then Jesus towards the end sort of asks the question again, which is absolutely incredible. He says, "Which of these three do you think?" I mean, it's like, what? I mean, there's no thinking about it. There's no supposing here. But Jesus has now set the trap.
Yeah.
This slightly potentially arrogant expert of the law, in your analogy, has gone back into the tiger's cage to have another go. And Jesus goes, "Okay, then let's do this. Let's do this." And so he introduces a Samaritan, tells the story, and this expert in the law is probably looking for the exit as quickly as possible. If he can get out of there, he would have done at that point. But of course, he's stuck because he's got to wait to the end of the story, because he's asked the question, who is my neighbor? Well, you can't leave halfway through the story. And so Jesus goes, okay, I love the way it's phrased here. Which of these three do you think is the neighbor? Now look at the answer. The expert of the law replied, the one who had mercy.
It's great.
It can't even use the S word. He can't even say Samaritan, because he's completely cornered. He's been had. And Jesus, in a stroke of genius, hasn't set out to trap the young man. I mean, there's nothing in the text that says that Jesus is toying with him. No. The young man has continuously pushed. So every time Jesus knocks it back, right, what do I have to do? Okay, what does the law say? How do you read it? Here's how I read it. Right, brilliant answer. Go and do it. But the young man pushes again, and he says, right, who is my neighbor? And Jesus goes, okay, I see what you're doing here, so let me tell you a story. And as soon as Samaritan is introduced to the narrative, everybody in the story, you don't need to be the smartest person in the room to know where this is going and where this is going to land. And of course, what is quite shocking, David, is that Jesus is suggesting that the Samaritan is practicing in a, can I say, perfect sense? He's practicing in a perfect sense the Torah. He is putting, if the expert of the law says, love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself, then Jesus has just demonstrated that a Samaritan has done exactly what you said he needed to do to live. Therefore, and of course then this doesn't happen, but then therefore, is that possible then as we head towards Samaria? As we head towards enemy territory? Is it possible? Is it possible Samaritans could keep Moses? Is it possible that Samaritans could do this and live? Because that's the unasked question in this. That's the unasked question in the conclusion to this parable. And of course, Jesus, in answer to the expert's answer, says, yeah, well, you go and do the same. The one who, he says, the one who had mercy, okay, you go and do the same.
Yeah.
Go and do what he did. So now, not only is the Samaritan the hero in the story, but now the Samaritan is held up as an example of Torah.
He's the prototype, isn't he?
Absolutely. It's like, okay, you want to see how it works? Follow the example of the Samaritan.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
My goodness. That's shocking. Absolutely.
Oh, it
I mean,
is.
it's contra. I think by the. I mean, there's no reaction in the Gospel of Luke here, and there are stories. As we've reflected before, we get to heaven. Maybe we'll get to see heaven flicks or something. And I would love to go to, right. Is there a section on what did the crowd look like at the end of that story? Because I just think people are going, did he just say what I think he just said? Did he just? And like, where does the expert of the law go at this point? He's like absolutely whacked by
He's
this.
done.
Yet by his own wisdom, he's been undone by his own hubris in some ways in
Yes.
this context. Incredible. I just found that magnificent.
So circle back around for a second into verse 36. I always am frustrated when I read this in English translations, and I never ever. I don't. I always used to say to my students when we used to talk about the original language behind the text, my students say, is it worth learning the original languages? And of course I want to say yes, but at the same time I also don't want to, English translations are very, very good, but every now and again, as is the case when you move from English to French or German to Spanish or whatever, you lose sometimes just a little bit of something because the translator has to make decisions, don't they? And I just would, if I was reading verse 36, which of these three do you think? I even like the idea of the way the Greek word there that's translated think could even be suppose. Like, I love that. Which of these three do you suppose? But I think a more accurate reading of the text there is this. Instead of where it often says, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man? Just look at the Greek for a second. I think it's more proper to read it. Which of these three became a neighbor to the man? Right. And I noticed a lot of the commentators. So again, you don't need to go and become a Bible language expert. You grab any of the commentaries; they start to pick up on this sort of language. Kenneth Bailey in his wonderful Jesus through Middle Eastern eyes. Like these books will just point that out to you without you having to go and learn these things. But which of these became a neighbor? And I love that that's and this is why I think it's almost missed if we don't translate it that way. The point is, was the Samaritan the man's neighbor? Well, the answer is actually no. He wasn't. They didn't know him. Any definition that you come up with neighbor, this Samaritan could theoretically end up outside of it. Is my neighbor the person that lives in the house next door to me? Is it the neighbor that is the person that lives opposite me? Is it somebody that's in my community? Could be my neighbor, be someone from my city. You're going to draw, as soon as you start trying to define something, you're going to have to draw a line somewhere. And so I think there's real power in translating this. Which of these three do you think became a neighbor? So I'm hearing Jesus almost say, by rights, all three of them could leave him alone. If you want to define a neighbor, the possibility is you could draw a circle that would let all three off the hook to say, this man's not my neighbor. I don't need to love him in the same way as I love myself, right? But Jesus actually chooses to show that what the Samaritan does is he rejects drawing a line and rather chooses to become a neighbor to the person. I was reading in one of the kind of famous Bible dictionary from the early 20th century. One of the writers on the word neighbor that's used just simply says this of the New Testament. He says one cannot define one's neighbor in the New Testament. One can only be a neighbor. And I love that sense. And so Jesus is actually saying almost to the man, well, you can exclude the Samaritans. Like, it's possible to draw a line that excludes them, or you can choose not to,
So good.
And now you start to see what's sort of making sense of the whole story as it's sort of filling out around that. And this sense of, you almost now harken back to the original interchange about love, don't you? That love becomes a choice. It's the verb that's driving this whole story, that the man chooses to the Samaritan, chooses to help this person. So love is this active component in this process. It's not something that happens. It's not something that's forced upon him. It's not as if he goes, oh, well, under the rules of the law, this person, I need to help them, so it's my duty. There's none of that in this. This to me seems like, if I'm reading that final verse 36 correctly, and the Greek to me seems quite clear on it, which of these became a neighbor. The man has actively chosen to go beyond what is imposed upon him. He only does this of his own free will. And in some sense, you can get that from the story, because all of a sudden he's using his own oil and wine, his own bandages, his own animal, his own money, his own time. This man has gone far beyond any expectations of him. It's quite stunning, isn't it?
It's magnificent. It's magnificent. And of course, there is that beautiful link into like the idea of this is not just, is Jesus leaning into this, not just an act of goodness to a neighbor, but this is an expression of love for God. So, can a person who doesn't know God be good to their neighbor? Of course they can. But in the context in which Jesus is ministering, he is forcing a connection between the idea of loving God and loving the people around you. And the two cannot be separated. And by implication, he's I think, suggesting that in loving his neighbor, the man is also showing awareness and love for Adonai. He's showing awareness and love for God himself, which is in the context of this story, of course, is an even more radical sort of potential interpretation. He's not just being a good bloke, because even a bad person can be a good bloke once in their life, But actually, the context is he's doing something, and even the way he does it, the way he invests himself into it, the way he, as it were, feels when he's doing it, is suggesting, in the language that Jesus is putting into this text, that this isn't just a man in an act of altruism. This is a man motivated by a passion and love for God himself. And so Jesus is drawing in this parable these two ideas together, which, of course, I think the trajectory of the New Testament picks up. John says, look, you can't claim to love God who you've never seen and then hate your brother who you do see. Those are contradictory ideas. The idea that we can have a sort of a compartmentalized spirituality where God is in one bit and my behavior to humans is in another bit. The whole idea of biblical spirituality right through the text is one of holistic behavior. And I think that's why the Torah is explicit in saying, even in a what we would say as Christians in Old Testament context, love God, love your neighbor, love the stranger. It does show a distinctiveness because people draw those lines. And the Lord is in fact saying, if you draw the lines, then you're actually not understanding the call to love God himself. And that call will always demand that we cross the road to that person, regardless of what label that person has on them. And I think like so many parables which we've touched on, I think there are multiple nuances to this. There's a very simple answer to this. There's also other things that lean into this. For me, that's really at the heart of it, that loving God and loving your neighbor are inseparable ideas. And I must never allow a spirituality to develop in me that applauds one without the other. I think in some ways that may have been what the religious community were guilty of, and Jesus accuses them of, is having a piety to God but ignoring their neighbor.
I think it's Walter Brueggemann, the great Old Testament scholar, who says that in the Old Testament, love of God is always worked out as love of neighbor. The two are inseparable, and I think that's a problem even for us in the contemporary context. There can be, in contemporary church, there's almost a sense of, well, let's all get serious about worshiping and loving God, and once we've done that, we'll then think about, mission. And, if you even think about a lot of churches, the whole structure is A, B, and then C is mission. C is how do we go and love our neighbor? And there's almost this sense that the Old Testament, Jesus and all these are saying, no, actually, just go start loving your neighbor. And that's the controversy of the parable, isn't it? Jesus is like, well, you want to see neighborliness? So therefore, implicitly in that is, let me tell you a parable about somebody who loved God with all their heart, their mind, their soul, and strength. And oh, guess what? It's a Samaritan. So there's this sense. So we would often go, oh, well, the ideal is first figure out loving God, then figure out how loving your neighbor. And I just think that the Old Testament has set up the basis that Jesus builds on. And as you say, it's John writes it in his letters. Actually, loving your neighbor comes from a deep love of God that's already in your heart, and that's how it works out. But if you don't love your neighbor, there's severe questions to ask about, in a non-judgmental way, but about whether you actually really love God. And then that kind of starts to loop around all sorts of stuff about the image of God, doesn't it? If humans are made in God's image, then there's a level of which, of course, our love for the image of God in each other, it reflects our love for God himself, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. And again, for listeners who may not be followers of Jesus, we're not saying that people who don't follow Jesus can't love their neighbor. But what we're saying is, if you claim to love Jesus, you should love your neighbor.
Yes.
Like you don't need faith to love your neighbor, but if you claim to have faith, you should love your neighbor. That's the point. So I can't divorce my vertical love from my horizontal responsibility. And the more I create a world that allows that separation, the more dangerous my religion becomes. And I think so as we lean into some of the other parables, as we touch on the lost things in episodes to come, I think you've got Jesus leaning more and more into this and challenging the religious community. You can't stand apart from people. You've got to engage with people. And that actually is a way of demonstrating you love God, by treating them with dignity, respect, and helping them in their lostness to be found.
In one sense, there's a level of, if somebody, well, okay, so maybe I don't follow Jesus, but I'm interested in follow Jesus. What should I do? Well, amongst the many things, now, and we're always cautious about saying, what should I do? Because this is a grace enterprise. And that's how the lawyer got in trouble in the first place with the question, what should I do? But maybe loving your neighbor's a good place to find God, and explore that. But then it's interesting, John, just thinking about that. If we're not careful, we can easily start to interpret this parable then as essentially hey, do good works.
Yep.
The secret is do good works. And I think it's worth doing a couple of things. One, the initial question about eternal life is kind of solved. And that's, you've answered orthodoxly. Your answer's fine, right? If you want to know how to live the God life, how to live as if God's kingdom is already, how to live as part of God's kingdom, love your neighbor, love God, right? And but then the second question now becomes, so, but who is my neighbor? And you get this sense of the care and the concern for your neighbor. We've got to be careful of not sounding out that Jesus comes away and basically says, so therefore, as long as you do these things, you get saved, right? Because that would undermine Luke's grace narrative, that actually Jesus has come to rescue us. If there is any rescuing happening, it's purely as a result of Jesus' grace. But if we're going to have a conversation on what neighborliness looks like, then we're going to have this parable. And I just wonder, John, if that point is subtly alluded to in Luke's positioning of the very next story, which is Mary and Martha.
Absolutely.
Where you have one person who's working hard to make it all right, and one person who just wants to learn from Jesus. And I don't know, maybe I'm overdoing it, but I just wonder if there's something there that's worth just paying attention to.
Yeah, it does, absolutely no harm to us to. That is an interesting, again, unique Lucan insertion. So the story of Mary and Martha, as we have it in Luke 10, doesn't appear anywhere else. We know that relationship is alluded to in other Gospels. So the fact that it follows this story, is that Dr. Luke just stuffing that in because, it does say to us that
they had space on the page.
that Jesus and his disciples were on their way. And so if they
Mm.
are heading south, then they're heading into Bethany, which is a couple of miles from Jerusalem. So this is a beautiful stop off point. Or
Mm.
also, is there something going on within the nuance of this that actually you've got a beautiful family that love Jesus,
Mm.
and Jesus clearly loves them, and is a wonderful intimate relationship with the three of them, the brothers, the two sisters, and the brother. Um, and yet there is a almost a franticness in Martha, which I totally understand. I'm more of a Martha in the way I'm wired than a Mary. Um, but there is a rest in Mary that embraces the grace moment. Martha believes she has to be doing in order to show her love for Jesus, which is absolutely wonderful. Whereas Mary is taking, in the best sense of the phrase, full advantage of Jesus here by simply experiencing the grace moment. And I think that is one of the tensions. What must I do? Tell Mary to do, get her to help me do. And I think humans are always leaning into the do. Um, so whenever we talk about doing, we must understand it in the context of grace and receiving, and doing as an expression of something that is actually fundamental in our world, rather than a getting of something. Whatever goodness I do, it is an expression of the goodness I have received. Whatever grace I give is an expression of the grace I've received, etc.
Well, what we do is a response, not an earning, isn't
Exactly.
it? That's and that's where we get so messed up. As soon as you start thinking, "Well, I do this," and even this comes to, we'll see this when we get to the parables of the lost things. Even when that comes to repentance, everything that we do is a response. I love. The great New Testament scholar J.L. Martin just made this: God always moves
Yeah.
first.
Beautiful.
So everything that we do is a response. So we don't earn it, we don't gain it. So when there is things to do, and there is things to do, God has called us to do things, but don't think they get you any better status with God. This is a response to encountering grace. That's how I've seen it,
Oh,
John. I don't know if
beautiful.
that.
No, absolutely. Would totally concur with that. And I think that is the essence of the heart of faith in response to his grace, that we respond. We do because of what has been done, and we give because of what we have received. It's freely you have received, therefore freely give. And I think if we hold on to that framework in our doingness, then it allows us to capture the best of all worlds and protects us from turning works into some sort of badge of honor or standard of living within our faith.
I love asking this question, and I keep asking it whenever I read a parable. Who am I in this parable? and and it's interesting that I want to be the Samaritan. That's who I want to be. I'm depressed to announce that probably too often I'm the priest and the Levite.
Sure.
But I also wonder if there's a nuance to the parable where actually I'm the guy beat up on the road. And ultimately, what do I need to do? The lawyer says, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? And if I step back and just let Luke, across two magnificent volumes of Luke and Acts, well, the answer to that question is, well, you don't need to do anything. You just need to accept that you're beat up on the side of the road, right? You need grace. That's actually where you are. You want to be the giver of grace, but before you get to be the giver of grace, you have to accept that you are first a receiver of grace, that you are, and so how do you align yourself with the person left half dead? And is there a resonance to Jesus there, that we actually, by the end of this gospel, we see Jesus not half dead, fully dead? So the way of the cross is first accepting, actually I need help, and some of the systems that I think will help me won't help me. There's a way again to turn the kaleidoscope and just see the parable slightly differently. That you might think help's coming from there, you might think it's coming from there. It's actually coming from a different a different place. And that's when I find myself resonating then with the Mary and Martha story some more, because I want to fight it. I want to be the doer. I want to be the doer. And it's almost as if the gospel is just constantly saying to me, well, you can be a doer, but first you got to be a receiver,
Oh, perfect. Absolutely. And in many ways, we are operating out of something we've received, which is that it. I think it's the heart of the law. I think it's the heart of Torah.
There's even a whole underlying monotheism to it all, isn't there? I love Paul's comment in Romans 3, where he says, it's just one of my favorite moments of Pauline argumentation, where Paul just says, well, is God not also the God of the Gentiles? Right? And which, of course, the answer for any good Jewish monotheist, there is only one God. I say it every day. The answer has to be yes. Either the Gentiles have no God, or they have another God, or they have the only God. And we don't believe in other gods. We don't believe it's possible that there is no God for a person. So we're actually cornered into admitting, well, if God's the only God and our God, he must also be their God. So there's that underlying resonance of, if you're going to love the Lord your God, you're going to love him in all the forms that he comes in, which means in all the neighbors that you encounter that carry his image, in that sense. It's quite... It's got there's some real resonance to it, isn't there? Of for us today, I think, John, it's just, it's there's so much division in the world.
True. And for us to recognize that in the Samaritan, something was there that most of the people in that crowd would have said wasn't there. And Jesus is saying, by his behavior, we are seeing that something deep of the truth of God's grace is within this man. And therefore, we look at his actions and ask, okay, what does that mean? And we're drawing into something deeper. And I think if we're prepared to be open to that and not simply fall into the trap of labels, but allow ourselves to go on journey with people and conversation with people, I think we will be surprised sometimes by who has what, who knows what, and who is what, rather than making the sorts of very generic and sometimes generalized conclusions about people, which I think are deeply unhelpful when it comes to engaging with them in a neighborly way.
And of course, that comment about identity, it just makes me want to end on the bombshell that we've got through this whole talk and not mentioned. Is there's just one thing that is never said in the whole parable.
Yeah.
Are you with me?
Yes, I am. Nowhere does it say he's good. Is that the one? Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, yeah.
It's absolutely true.
The one thing that's not said in the parable is that the Samaritan is good.
Yeah.
And on that bombshell.
Yeah. We'll leave it there.
Okay, that's it for episode 6. Thanks so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. If you want to get in touch with either of us about something we said, you can reach out to us on podcast@twotexts.com or by liking and following the Two Texts podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you did enjoy the episode, we'd love it if you left a review or comment where you're listening from. And if you really enjoyed this episode, why not share it with a friend? And don't forget, you can listen to all our podcasts at twotexts.com or wherever you get your podcasts. But that's it for this episode. We'll be back on Monday, May 31st for another week of daily episodes. But until then, goodbye.